Welcome to this session with me on Assessment for Learning. I want to start this session by having some time talking about what is assessment before we launch into talking about specifically what learning stories are, because learning stories are one form of assessment, and for early childhood services and for teachers working with children and families, we must always have a number of assessment approaches that we use. So assessment is defined here by Mary Jane Drummond, and this is, you'll find this in Kei Tō Te Pai, our assessment exemplars. It just really sums up what assessment practice is for, and that's so that we can observe what's going on in the environment with young people and with adults too, and then put what we understand from those observations to good use, to use that information to make decisions about how to support ongoing and success in learning. These ideas are from Kei Tō Te Pai, and if you look in the first folder with all of the books, you'll find that these headings are all very familiar. I'm not going to linger on each of them individually, but I want you to be mindful of going to this resource, going to Kei Tō Te Pai, getting it off the shelf. You don't have to engage with all of the examples at the back of the book, but definitely have a read of the literature section in the very front. It's a light read and it's very, very informative. It gives a good background about what's important in a socio-cultural approach to assessment. It brings up some key points which we must always be mindful when we're thinking about assessment with children and assessing learning. Documenting assessment is important. That helps us to revisit it, to see how our approaches to assessment, what we're paying attention to over time, are shaping. And it's important for us to keep a view of learning as complex, to never relax and just be complacent about what sort of learning is valued. We must constantly, as teachers, be fine-tuning the complexity of what we're able to observe and recognise as learning. Having clear goals and outcomes, this is really, really important, and that doesn't necessarily mean that the adults determine what those goals and outcomes are, although that is part of our professional responsibility. One of the key parts here about goals is listening out for the questions that children are asking themselves, because those are their learning goals in that moment. That's their curiosity. That's what they're interested in. Assessment is based in the everyday context. We don't have to create artificial spaces. Early childhood services are artificial enough, and even though for many children it's their everyday context, it's a secondary context. So keeping it real, keeping the artifacts, the tools, the materials children are using real and in the everyday context is also critical. Protecting and enhancing the motivation to learn. We must always be thinking about how we can hook children into learning, and I don't mean just children, I actually mean adults and children, all people, parents, anyone else in the community who interacts with you. How can we, as the teachers and those professionals in that space, continue to motivate others to learn? Acknowledging uncertainty is another part of assessment, planning, supporting learning. Having rigorous, tight plans that we stick to isn't always going to work. In fact, the majority of times it won't work. So getting comfortable with uncertainty is an important part of liberating your creativity around assessment. Listening to children is important. Listening to children doesn't mean just listening to what they say. Listening to children means observing, reading physical cues, listening to the way they express themselves through the arts, paying close attention, watching, keeping a distance, and really tuning in to what is spinning that person or that child's wheels at this time. Collective assessments also, and we'll go on to that hopefully a bit more, but in essence what that's talking about is more than one person being responsible for documenting assessments. So that's not just one person's opinion that's forming up something that's documented and then therefore is in the portfolio often. So collective assessments bring a deeper richness to assessment practice. Refer you back here to Te Whāriki, because assessment for learning and assessment practices in education, especially in early childhood, are based on the principles of Te Whāriki. Often there's a big lean on the strands at the back end of the Te Whāriki document. One of the important things for a teacher shaping their identity within the profession to always remember is that the most important things to assess and evaluate in early childhood services are the 4 principles: relationships, empowerment, holistic, and family whānau community. So those are very important dimensions of what it makes up the assessments. And of course that links in to this aspiration statement, which is straight from Te Whāriki. Now I'm going to lead into learning stories, because I know that's what people are really, really interested in. Learning stories are defined here by Margaret Carr, who in 1999 with Val Podmore prepared a research project for the Ministry of Education, and it is called Learning and Teaching Stories. So I want to acknowledge right from the onset that it's not just about learning stories, that it's about learning and teaching stories, which that point will make more sense when you watch the next movie on this DVD. So learning stories are about how we do observations in our everyday settings. So you can see the link back to the everyday context. And it's about that they tell a story cumulative over a period of time. So it's one story after another, or many stories told over a period of time. Of qualitative, which is formative, or I'm just trying to think of the right words, that provides description and is qualitative information or qualitative assessment generally is thought to be useful for informing ongoing thinking, whereas you'll come across quantitative assessment, which is more about telling a story about something in a point in time, and it's usually now historical and may or may not be used to inform ongoing practice. So qualitative practices are considered to be more purposeful in an early childhood service, although I do think there's a time to count numbers and do some quantitative data as well. So after that little ramble, for learning stories, it is about cumulative over time, that they feed forward or that they are used to inform ongoing decisions, and they are strongly linked to the target domains for learning dispositions, and that's a whole other movie. So what is a learning story? A learning story will make the connections between the child's home and their experiences within your service, and really does push home that families and teachers are in a partnership, so that what learning experiences the children have when they're in the early childhood service build on and add value to their real lives with their family. And when that happens in an early childhood service, that's the ultimate. It's not so much about teachers telling children and families what they should do for learning. It's more about teachers being open and having a partnership and working in ways that strengthen the family. So what's different about learning stories? This comes from a very amazing reading. It came out, you'll see, in 2002, so it's nearly 10 years old. But in my view, someone who's getting their heads around what learning stories are about, this is one of the best articles, and I'll make that available to you if you send me your email. So what is different about learning stories? The first point that they raise, that Lorraine and Anne raise, is around narrative, and that writing a story and using the narrative approach is a useful way to record learning. And there's a growing body of research in education and in other disciplines such as in counselling and health, where the narrative is seen as a very formative, useful tool for assessment. So you can see in the health it has an application as well. Talks about objectivity, making multiple voices visible, and that's again having many conversations with families, with each other, with your colleagues, with teachers, with children, with people in the community, with people like me. So when you start to make multiple voices visible, more than one person, if more than one person is saying something about the learning, then it's more likely to be real and validated. So yeah, objectivity is quite important, although no one is ever purely objective. I mean, everyone sees the world as they are, not how it is. That's sort of me and my philosophical part for the day. Learning dispositions are valued and therefore what is also paid attention to. Now this is really, really important. Dispositions are those attitudes or those habits of mind that a person brings to the learning. So are they inclined to be interested? When things get tricky, do they stay with it or do they give it up? What is this person's attitude towards supporting other people's learning? Will they put their own learning aside so that someone else in their space, that they have more skills, that they can add value to that? So dispositions, and there are more than 5, but Margaret Carr and Val Podmore came up with those 5 because they most closely align to the strands of Te Whāriki. But of course, many early childhood services identify with their families, whānau children, and with their own, what they think about things, their own dispositions that are valued in their particular service. So keeping it connected to Te Whāriki, but also putting your own flavour on it as well. This is a very credit-based, the next bullet point around that learning flows from paying attention to strengths and interests. I've got lots of different thoughts about that, but I definitely do believe that success builds success, and when children experience success in learning and are celebrated and that's paid attention to, then you're more likely to get more of the same. It's a bit of a behaviourist approach, but nonetheless I think there's some merit in that idea. And this is the last point that Anne and Lorraine raise in this article, which I really like, is that the teaching as well as learning is important. So when you do the next, have a look at the next movie on this DVD, you'll see there are some really specific targeted questions that ask you to identify what teaching was going on. What did the adults do to support the learning? How did you set up the environment? Did that make a difference? Did you make some changes to the resources? Did you go and access some specific resources? Within a learning story, and of course it's because the original framework was always called a learning and teaching story, that putting that teaching in the story is as important to document as any of the other features.